Boardroom Bound, Episode 88, Keeping Up with the Evolution of the Boardroom with Peter Crow.
There needs to be an active focus on the future, otherwise the default will be back to the past. And there's a very simple human psychology almost reason to this, and that we find it easier to scrutinise what's gone because it's concrete, rather than thinking about the future and options, which can be more abstract.
Hello, and welcome to this episode of Boardroom Bound. My name is Alexander Lowry, and this is the podcast dedicated to intentional leadership in the boardroom. My goal is to give aspiring and existing directors the tips, tactics, and strategies necessary to transform your confidence and build a successful career as a board director. Quick reminder, you can get all of today's show notes at podcast.gordon.edu. And in today's episode, we're speaking to someone all the way around the world, from Dr. Peter Crow, who's joining us from New Zealand. Peter is someone who has a PhD in corporate governance and strategy, 20-year career in a boardroom. He is an company director and international board advisor. He has been there and done that in just about every company you can imagine across all the different continents and the countries. Brings all that expertise for us today to hear what might we want to do and what we might want to avoid. Let's jump into the show. Peter Crow, welcome to the Boardroom Bound podcast.
Thank you very much. It's a delight to be with you today.
So we were talking about what a small world it is that you can be sitting in New Zealand and I can be sitting in Boston, and we can have a conversation as if we were side by side. So there are some things about the modern technology which are amazing. And, another good example of that is, I'm going to use the word, you're an expert in corporate governance and strategy. You have your PhD in this, and you advise organizations all across the world. And clearly there are some nuances between different societies and rules. And yet you were able to do that with different places. The world has changed a bit with COVID, and clearly neither of us are jumping on planes with the frequency we used to before. And perhaps Zoom and other platforms are our friends now. But still, you have this knowledge that we can share. And I'm delighted you can bring it to our audience today. And anyone who opened up your LinkedIn profile would just see pages and pages of all of the groups that you teach with, the organizations you connect with and are served on the boards of and advise. So thrilled that you can share that with our audience today. But to get to this position of authority took you a long time to build to it. So let's just start with a bit of your background and experience, and we'll build up to it.
Thanks very much, Alex. Gosh, that sounds a wonderful introduction, very gracious, and but it is, as you say, a long journey. I first graduated about 35, 36 years ago with a technology and management degree, having grown up in rural New Zealand. But of relevance to this audience and this topic, I first entered the boardroom around about 20 years ago, so there's a couple of decades of practical experience as a director, as a chair, as a committee contributor, alongside advisory work, the PhD that you've mentioned. Most of my work has been with privately held companies, aspirational high-growth companies, working across that nexus between the board itself and the chief executive, and helping these organisations to understand how they can contribute to high performance in the business, how they can balance between fulfilling their fiduciary and statutory duties, but also focus on what the shareholder needs, what the company needs, so that it can endure and be prosperous into the future. So the work, as you've said, is an international contribution. Around about 40% of my time I'm actually working as a director, and the balance is that advisory and teaching, and I do a bit of writing and public speaking as well. So it's a mixed bag, which keeps me interested, but also it enables me to move as various priorities and friends come to the fore in different places around the world.
So, Peter, let's start drawing upon all this great background knowledge and experience that you have and educate our audience. I think today the focus for us, let's talk about characteristics of high-performing boards. And let me paint the scene for our audience. I'd love you to talk to, because Many of our audience are already in the C-suite or knocking on the door. And at some point they're thinking, either I want to be now or perhaps in the near future, medium term, whatever, I want to be on boards. And that's something I envision, I picture for myself. There's a very different skill set to be good in the C-suite to being good in the boardroom, however we want to define that, right? So you can call it maybe noses in, fingers out as your new philosophy when you're in the boardroom. You have to figure out, I'm not the doer anymore. I need to help coach, guide the doer. And there's a fine line. How do you help someone figure out the difference?
What an amazing question to start off with. And I think the introductory comment that you made, that it's that distinction between doing and guiding, is the North Star in this situation. When you're an executive, your job is to run the business and implement strategy exactly as you've summarised. But as soon as you step into the boardroom, that's delegated off to somebody else. It's no longer you anymore. The second observation is that the manager has direct staff and they can direct them, whereas the board, and they can do that individually. Whereas a board is a team situation. A board in statute is very simply the collective term for the directors as a group. Their peers, one amongst the directors, is a little bit different. That's the role called chair. And so they make decisions in the collective, and nobody's got all the answers. And they've only got one employee, quote unquote, which is the chief executive. So everything happens through that individual, he or she, the chief executive. So the differences are these. The individual director needs to bring big picture thinking to the table. They need to be focused on what's best for the organisation over the medium and longer term. They need to understand why this company exists, what its strategy might be to achieve that longer term aim or purpose, and what resources are available and what resources need to be brought to bear to achieve that strategy, to advance towards that purpose. That's the first sort of thing. So that's that performance orientation. Then, of course, there are statutes and regulations that sit at the national or international level. But beyond that, there's policies within the business that need to be established around health and safety, human resource, and various operating parameters. These are simply rules, and rules, of course, don't drive performance, but they drive boundaries in terms of what's acceptable or not. So the role of the incoming director is to make sure that we know where we're going, we make sure what the operating rules are, and then we focus on contributing to decision-making, to advancing the business into the future. But that's only part of it. The balance is that, and this is the part that many directors and many boards spend more time on actually, is monitoring the historical performance. And we don't have to be rocket scientists to understand that when we look in the rearview mirror, we're looking at what's already done, not where we're going. And if you're anything like me, you're not very confident as a driver if you spend most of your time looking in the rearview mirror instead of out the windscreen towards where you're intending to go.
Especially with the world just changing so dramatically, right? You can't look backwards. Exactly. And yet, many boards claim they're spending as much as 25 or even 40% of their time looking out the front, looking forward. The interesting thing when I'm in boardrooms and put the watch on them or assess what they're doing is that they're spending as little as 10% of their time looking forward. Most of their time they're digging into the detail, the chief executive's report, the finance, the numbers, scrutinising compliance to various regulations, all of which is necessary, but none of which takes the business into the future. It's almost getting bogged down into tick box and check box activity. And I really question whether that adds value to the business or whether it's just another layer of audit type activity to provide an assurance that we're doing what we said we would. So that's fascinating because there's such a balance there between helping an organization to make sure they have everything in place they need today to be successful, but also while trying to prepare for the future, but also learning from what's happened in the past, right? Because we don't want to repeat it. And there's probably, I don't know, whistleblower data, for example, might be a good thing to look at from historical because that might be a predictor of future results. What is the best way for a board, do you think, to actually try and balance all of these?
Yeah, that's a real difficulty because in some industries and some sectors, some business sectors, the big industrials that have got lots of heavy equipment, health and safety and compliance and regulation are really important and necessarily so. Banking, where there's been just a seeming endless stream of organisations that have become greedy or for which malfeasance or other behaviours have come to the fore. The regulatory is really, really important and the compliance. But the balance off, the chairman's got an amazingly important role here to actively encourage, and you do it through the agenda, do it through setting of the culture in the boardroom, which pervades through to the chief executive and beyond, and also the reporting that the board asks the chief executive to present for their regular board meetings. That there needs to be an active focus on the future, otherwise the default will be back to the past. And there's a very simple human psychology almost reason to this. And we find it easier to scrutinise what's gone because it's concrete, rather than thinking about the future and options, which can be more abstract and have got a lot more risk and they're associated with possibilities rather than blackness and whiteness as to what will or won't happen. So boards, individual directors, need to read widely. I argue that directors need to be prepared even to think about philosophy. Maturity and wisdom is really important. Directors should be speaking with each other between board meetings. As a general rule of thumb, for each board seat that a director occupies, they should be thinking in terms of 1 week's effort per board per month as a reasonable working minimum. They should understand those emerging trends. They've got to look for weak signals. Every director should know how to understand the finances, of course, the strategy, but many don't, the implications of the strategy, the technologies around AI and cyber and all these things. Directors are building increasing levels of awareness around these, but to say that their decision-making is informed is still a little way off. There's a wonderful piece of research that was done probably about 5 years ago now that identified that as few as 1 in 6 directors understands the business of the business and the competitive landscape. And that was a shock to me, because what it says is that 1 in 6 directors in a boardroom is informed to be able to make a good decision, which begs the question what the other 5 are basing their decisions upon. It's
Wow.
scary, isn't it?
It is. That is a disturbing statistic. It's interesting when you think about, let's say, a skills matrix for a board, and they're thinking about, and I'd love your thoughts, and let's pretend you're designing a board from scratch, what the best methodology would be. Clearly, you need certain types of people in the boardroom, and it could be based on the industry that you're in or you're about to go through. I don't know, think about a nonprofit board I serve with. They're going to be building a building soon. Well, you might want a real estate expert. You might need an architect in there. Maybe you just hire them as a guide for a short term. It depends what you need to do. But think about who you intentionally should have had in there. And I would have thought it's incumbent upon every board member to be doing what you just talked about, the reading, the expertise. We all need to be growing and developing, whether you need to be learning about cyber or social media or the marketing, whatever it might be. So how do you think the ideal board should be structured? Let's pretend there's a brand new company comes to you, Peter, and says, we need to design the best practice in governance. What would that look like?
The first thing that we need to acknowledge is the phrase that you've just used, and I'm going to put the double quotes around it, is a phrase that we perhaps need to set to one side. It's a useful term, but it's a term that gets us unwittingly into a little bit of trouble, and that's the term best practice, because the implication is that there's one best way of doing it. So we need to acknowledge straight up that every board is to some extent unique, every company, every not-for-profit, and times change as well. You know, December last year and what we might have been thinking about and talking about in a board is radically different from April, May, June 2020, simply because the situational context is different. So fundamentally there are three things that matter most if a board is going to maximise its effectiveness and exert influence and focus the company on what really matters, which is high levels of performance. And they are the capabilities of those directors, what they bring into the room. And you've already mentioned some of them. There needs to be deep sector knowledge across those directors. So we need to assemble a board that the majority of those directors understand the sector. They don't all have to be experts. In fact, we want some that are lesser because they'll ask different types of questions. So sector expertise needs to be present, and for those that don't have sector expertise, they need to at least have sector interest. It'd be no point, for example, looking to appoint me onto, for example, a board of a gaming or gambling type of business that was based in Los Angeles, because I've got no interest in that at all, and therefore my contribution and my background reading would not take place because I've got no interest, and therefore what contribution would I make in the boardroom? So the first thing is sector knowledge. The second thing is technical expertise. So finance, legal, strategy. They're the big three, but also our ability to bring in maturity and wisdom across the board, our contribution to playing as a team, and our commitment to work collectively, not individually. They're the big things around assembling the board. Recently in New Zealand, or a year or two ago now, a company called Fletcher Building struggled and failed, and when the analysis was done, few if any of those directors had a deep understanding of the construction industry. So they were making informed decisions based on what they knew, but sadly, the thing that they most needed, which was the industry knowledge, was lacking. So they were making decisions on paper rather than decisions in context. So that first thing is what the directors bring, and assembling the board around that is really crucial. But it's not sufficient, and this brings in the next piece is what the board does when it's together, and the best model that I have seen over the last 20 or 25 years is the model that emerged out of Bob Tricker's work and Bob Garrett's work, which is called the Learning Board, where the focus is on four things that the board needs to do around strategy and purpose, policy making, monitoring and supervising management, and providing an account to shareholders and other stakeholders. And then the third big area in terms of assembling a board is to get the behaviours in such a place that the directors can work together, because they're called in law to act together. So they need to make decisions. So they need to be able to listen, be actively engaged, have a sense of purpose. So are we there for a common reason? Be strategically competent, be able to make a decision. So are these director candidates comfortable with vigorous debate? Are they situationally aware? Have they got the cognition that they can deal with complexity and complicated issues, that they can work through all of this. And of course, have they got a mindset that's of a coach where they're supporting and guiding and correcting, or have they got a mindset of a policeman where we've got almost punitive responses if something goes wrong? The former rather than the latter is better on the control element. So there's just some comments there that I hope might be useful for people as they consider assembling a board.
So Peter, I'd love to...
Notice...
Go ahead, yeah.
Oh, sorry. I was just going to say, notice I didn't talk too much about the size of the board or quote, diversity, unquote, because structural elements such as those are not a direct predictor of business performance. The size of the board we know from group dynamics, somewhere between 5, 6, 7, 8 is reasonable, above which we start to get freeloaders, but it's not black and white in terms of exactly how many is best. But if we want multiple perspectives when we're looking at problems before we make a decision, then we meet people from different backgrounds so that we can cover those different angles. And so those are some of the contributing factors that people often run towards because they see them. But diversity per se, independence per se, board size per se, none of these are directly predictive of future company performance. And there's plenty of research around all of those parameters.
Peter, I'd also love your thoughts when we think about roles and responsibilities. You talked about the chairman earlier on the show. And certainly in America, I realize rules and regulations differ by countries, norms are different, but I would say one of the issues that concerns me watching America's boardroom is the large number of chairmen who are also CEOs. And you think of the board's role and responsibility of who they're representing, who they're reporting to, and how it's supposed to work. There's a fine line there that can easily be crossed. Now, my prior role, JP Morgan, I would say Jamie Dimon is the best banker of his generation. And if there's anyone who had the capability to do both of those roles, it is Jamie. But the question is, should Jamie have both of those roles? Should anyone be in both of those positions? I'd love your thoughts.
Well, I was going to add Larry Fink to that list as well, sitting beside, BlackRock, same sort of thing. Up until the turn of the century, something like 90% of the listed firms in America, the chair and the chief executive, the president, whatever title you want to apply, was one person. And that was really, really good because the arguments between those two roles could be easily settled within the mind of one person. But the background in Europe and through the Commonwealth is a much greater tendency to two separate people. Mm-hmm. Alexander, the issue here is of accountability. You're a director full-time, you're a chief executive full-time. It's very difficult to manage the reporting and the accountability and the responsibility. And the concentration of power is, I would argue, too great if you've got one person in two roles. So just imagine this. You've got a board of directors of whom the chairman is also the chief executive, and the board makes a decision that asks the chief executive to implement or issues a directive to implement. But the chief executive is also the chair and may also be an influential person in terms of the shareholders. Very, very difficult to hold the chief to account when the chief is coordinating the activities of the board. I'm a reasonably strong proponent of separating those roles right out because they're fundamentally different functions in the business. One is to coordinate the collective decision-making of the board. The other is to run the business day to day. And I think from a shareholder perspective, there's an increasing expectation that those roles are separated and as happens in many places around the world, just less so in the States. I haven't done the numbers recently, but as of a couple of years ago, that 90% concentration that was typical up to 2,000 has softened to something like 50%. I know some great companies for which those two roles within one person are very successful, but I also know some companies where perhaps because those two roles are concentrated, that's a limit on performance and influence of that company into the future.
Right. Now, Peter, one of the things that I also find fascinating about your background experience is that you work around the world. So different cultures, different companies, different styles, and you've seen best practices that could be transported different places. So my 7 years living in London, I came back to America thinking, wow, they did these really good business models, these spaces. If I came back and started a business here, I would import these sorts of things. You've probably seen that in the board space of like, wow, this country does this really well. This would be so successful to bring to other places. Are there sort of ideas that you pick out from the trainings that you do around the world and the organizations you work with? You go, this is phenomenal, and it could whether come back home to me in New Zealand or to America or exported somewhere else.
Yes, I've worked in across 5 continents over the last 20 years in various ways, and the important insight that I got early on is you leave the legal stuff behind, because the legal stuff are the rules that are in situ in that particular country, and they provide the framework within which the board sits and governance and all of that. So if we concentrate on what the board does and some of those bigger practices, I've long held in high esteem the work and the way that the Nordics, so the Swedish, Finnish, Norwegian, for example, countries, the way they operate, some of the European main continent, and through the Commonwealth, and that is they tend to meet more frequently, typically monthly, sometimes every 2 months. So they're together talking about the issues and making decisions on a more ongoing basis. So that moves the balance of power from a strong chief executive and operating the company where the board is almost serving the chief to a much more balanced situation where the board understands that it's the ultimate decision maker and point of accountability to shareholders and others. So more frequent meetings, desirable and more common in those countries. The second is that some of the economies that have developed over the last, say, 20 years, and I'm thinking of the Baltic states, but also some of the Gulf states in the Middle East and through into Africa. I was on a call to Kenya just last week, where they're looking to multiple places around the world and saying, what are the principles in action here? And as soon as they ask that question, they're implying that they're setting rules to one side and thinking about the complexities and what can we pick out. And many of them look to the UK and some of the governance codes there. And many of them look across the Commonwealth. Sadly and surprisingly, the number of those emerging economies that look to the US is relatively slim. And when I ask them about that, they tell me that it's a rules orientation, it's strict and structural, and that what they're looking for is an environment that's perhaps a bit less combative, where there's a strong focus on culture and a strong focus on performance, but in 3 dimensions. The economic performance, so the finance, it's got to be there, but also the more social and environmental elements. Now, I'm not saying ESG, I've got a view on that, but more C, social, economic and environmental, so we don't lose sight of the numbers. So the board in these emerging economies are saying, you know what? there's a bigger picture here. We want to perform at high levels, but we want to perform in context. And there's a lot of countries and economies that have gone before us. What can we learn? And so that, just in summary, the Scandinavians and through the Commonwealth meeting more regularly, the strong focus on performance in multiple dimensions, and the collegial nature of the board that's more apparent in some countries than others, as opposed to a combative shareholder maximisation view that has tended to prevail.
So, Peter, on the flip side, I wonder if it's just a simple question to ask. I would think like, geez, I wonder what poor governance looks like. If you were to describe the do the antithesis of this, how would you phrase that up?
I was involved in a piece of work probably about 5 or 6 years ago, and I use it around the world as an example. And sometimes I cite the company name. I'm not going to today. And I usually start the conversation with the size of the board and the industry sector, and then I get a piece of paper, fold it in half, and then tear it into two, so that the group that I'm working with can hear the sound of tearing paper. And I say, that was the sound heard at the beginning of the board meeting for most board meetings. And it was the sound of the envelope containing board papers being opened for the first time. So this was a board for which at least one of the directors backed himself to read the papers on the fly and participate in the decision-making process. The company became insolvent. So in terms of poor governance, the issues are these. And it's quite simple. There's a pattern. Directors that display arrogance, hubris, malfeasance, ineptitude, directors that just not engage. They back themselves, all of that. So there's a common pattern across those behavioural attributes. The second is the reporting is not well defined, and the responsibility for what goes into the board pack, I'm not talking about specific details, but in terms of the general content, is left for the chief executive to determine. In good communications, the listener is the determinant of whether the communication is effective or not. Imagine if I'm speaking in French only, you're in English, and your ability to understand is compromised because you don't have my language, and so I speak slower and louder. It makes it worse because it gets you upset. So effectiveness is in the mind and the eye of the receiver, the customer, if you will. So it's on the board to determine what it wants to see, the sequence of events in the board pack. So all of that's laid out. Otherwise, the chief executive will determine what goes in, and sadly, very few chief executives are mind readers. So they'll put in what they think, and the board will have to wear it if they don't say anything else. So a pattern of failure, another common pattern is that the reporting is not squared away. And the third is the lack of strategic foresight. So the board, because it lacks strong levels of engagement, inquiring mind, trying to determine weak signals and getting early frame on changes in the marketplace, it's just not in a position to have intentional conversations and debates about where next and how to get there. So three things that are common in poor governance: poor engagement, poor reporting, and poor foresight.
Well, if I try to summarize that together with some of the stuff we've talked about before, for example, you were talking about some of the Scandinavian best practice of meeting more regularly. If you could peer into your crystal ball for me and imagine a bit of what the future of the boardroom is going to look like, let me paint a scenario and get your thoughts on this. I envision that some boards they might be meeting, say, crazy regularly now, maybe every week because of the crisis of what's going on with COVID.
Yeah.
Probably not going to be the norm at that pace. That's unsustainable. But instead of meeting together, let's say 4 times a year in person, they might say, you know what, let's keep 2 times a year in person because we have to have that. We need those face-to-face, the relationship building conversations. But we can meet, let's say, every month. And maybe some of them are 1-hour check-ins where we're just doing on Zoom. Maybe every quarter, the ones we're not in person, maybe it's a 3 or 4 hour long Zoom meeting where there's a lot of stuff we go through. So they are meeting more regularly. They are having the conversations on a more regular basis. Do you envision something like that? Or how would you paint it and suggest we don't waste this crisis and we use it to change the board in the right way? Because maybe it's not worth the time for all the people to get on a plane and the expense. We can do a lot of it just regularly by the technology we have.
So never waste a good crisis is a reasonably well-known phrase now, isn't it? So one of the boards that I'm on, in fact, I chair. We meet monthly. We meet in person, and it's a private equity funded business. So it's a big aspiration business and strong commercial set of priorities. We are talking about, and will probably move to a 50-50 model where half of our board meetings are in person and half of our board meetings are on video conference, Zoom, Teams, whatever. And our in-person meetings will have a high emphasis on strategy, on strategizing, and on future options. And our online meetings will have more of a, let's just say, an operational compliance type of focus. The crisis was quite interesting in terms of what I heard with people around the world and what I experienced. And first up, Zoom became a thing. Everybody was running towards Zoom, and boards were no exception. But what was fascinating when I was talking to directors after they'd been through maybe 2 Zoom cycles of board meetings is they didn't like it anymore. And what they missed was the social interaction, the non-verbal communication cues, and their ability to pass notes and interact more richly in the way that they'd been used to in an in-person meeting. I think where it's going to stabilise is something in a mix, and it's going to be different for different companies. Some companies will move to a 50-50 type of model, such as what I've just talked about, and some will revert to a full in-person model. I do not see boards strongly dominating towards an electronic mindset with video to replace in person. I think that would be dangerous because the nuances of the collective decision making would be greatly at risk. There's a lot goes on also in the evenings and in the interaction with staff that come into the room, and the board's ability to go out onto the factory floor or the professional office or whatever the business is, and actually talk and see and perhaps do a customer meeting as well. So they're all components that would enrich the board's understanding of the business and of the wider ecosystem that would be difficult to achieve if it was online. So I think a mix back to full in-person is where it's going to land.
Well, I think that makes a lot of sense, and I like the model you're prescribing to us there. And I think we've done a great full 360 review in some ways of the high-performing board characteristics, the poor governance stuff to avoid, and perhaps to bring all together for some ideas for the future. So, Peter, we were delighted to have you on the show today. Thank you for sharing your insights, your expertise, and helping all of us to become Boardroom Bound.
Thank you very much, Alexander. It's a pleasure to contribute.
That's it for this episode of Boardroom Bound. I really enjoyed chatting with Dr. Peter Crow. This is someone who has so much expertise and in a very gentle, careful, simple way is able to tell us these are the characteristics of a high-performing board. Run to those. And here's the ideas of what poor governance looks like. Run from those. And then we brought it together, sort of looking into the crystal ball, thinking what could a new model look like for the boards and their layouts. And remember, if you head over to podcast.gordon.edu, you will find links to everything that we talked about for today's show. And please know that the Boardroom Bound team and I are so proud to be your go-to podcast for all things that connect, prepare, and empower you to land a board seat. Be sure to subscribe to this podcast so you'll miss any of the high-quality content that we're bringing to you every Wednesday. Thanks for joining me today. I can't wait to share more stories and strategies from brilliant business minds with you again next week. Remember to keep tuning in to be Boardroom Bound.